Hi everybody, my name is Cameron Davis. In a previous life, I was the national water spokesperson on the Obama-Biden 2008 campaign. We have a whole bunch of great thinkers here on the stage, but first I want to set the stage for what we're going to chat a little bit about. Let's start with the basic understanding that we all have one planet that we share with one another, and that we all care deeply about that planet because we do share it. And as much as we are hearing the parade of horribles that's going on in Washington, D.C., there's a lot of good stuff that is going on in the world as well. Today's discussion really is about one thing, and that is how can we use our ecosystem to help strengthen our political system? And you're going to hear that teased out in a bunch of questions. But for right now, setting the stage, there's a lot of good stuff going on in the world. For example, we have with GE now selling wind turbines that are twice as powerful as they were just a few years ago. Solar panels are selling faster. They're getting cheaper, and their performance is increasing as never before. And we're moving from a society where families who could afford them would have 2 cars. Now we've got ride sharing. We've got millennials who don't even want to buy cars anymore. So we're moving away from a fossil fuel-based economy, still have a lot of it, to something that's very, very different and something that is more sustainable. So a lot of good things that are going on right now in the world, but we have to keep moving the needle. And that's why we've got these amazing speakers here today. First of all, we've got Ryan Blitzstein, who is a VP of Renewable Energy at UpTake, and in a former life, Ryan, you can just raise your hand if you want, led the statewide campaign to end gerrymandering in Illinois. We heard a lot about that today. We've got Howard Lerner, who is here as a public interest attorney and the executive director of the Environmental Law and Policy Center, which is doing amazing work every day to drive clean energy and sustainable development in the Midwest. We've got Michelle Carr, the director of the Nature Conservancy's Illinois chapter, who joined that group, TNC, in 2013. Before that, for 16 years, was an advisor with Goldman Sachs. And we have Jack Darin, executive director of the Illinois chapter of the Sierra Club, which is a 501c4, very active in political endorsements and environmental policy. So as you can tell, we've got some really good masterminds here, people who think about the intersect of politics and policy in the environmental world every single day. And what we want to do is just kick off with a bunch of questions. My hope is we'll have some time for questions from you as we move on. But the first question is, opportunity is embedded in crisis. What opportunities exist to marshal ecosystem protection to change our political ecosystem? In other words, what are the barriers to improve our political system so that we can better protect the environment? And let's just go right on down the line, and we'll start with Ryan.
Okay, awesome. Thanks a lot, Cam, and thanks to you all for being here. So I think this is the kind of set of strategies that are sort of standard in the political world, whether you're on environment or another issue. So we've got to play an inside game. So there's a lot of work that progressives need to do to out-organize, out-fundraise, out-message, just win against the folks that don't share our interests and are climate deniers. I think there's an outside game too, not just the outside of politics or outside the system, but really in the business world. I mean, if you look at the developments that Cam mentioned, a lot of them are happening in the private sector because companies are figuring out just using market forces to take advantage of new technologies. The work that UpTake is doing, just to use one example, is using predictive analytics to make heavy industry more efficient, but also to make solar, wind, and other renewable energies more cost competitive with the fossil fuels that exist right now. So that's a part of this world. And then the third piece, I think, is really important, not just in the world of the environment, but everywhere, and that's to actually change the roots of the system. So if you look at books like Ornstein and Mann's, it's even worse than you think, ending partisan gerrymandering, ending the influence of money in politics, changing the rules of voting rights. Those are all things that I think folks who are progressive and looking at climate policy need to look at, in addition to the core focus on just how do we improve climate policy in a specific term.
You know, some people think, and thank you, Cam, for inviting us, and thank you, everybody, for joining us. Some people talk about elections being about winning a majority of the votes. It's actually more nuanced than that. If it were just a majority, Hillary Clinton would have been president, and Al Gore would have been president. It's about where you win your majorities and how you put that majority together. President Trump won the last election by 76,000 votes in the Great Lakes states, in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. That was the difference in the election. So then it becomes a question of what are the issues that make a difference to swing voters in the swing areas of those states. We did 12 focus groups. We hired Ann Selzer, who's absolutely terrific. 4 focus groups in Grand Rapids, Michigan, 4 in Toledo, Ohio, 4 in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Trump voters in November of 16, half working class, half rural. Protecting the Great Lakes, safe, clean drinking water. Those are issues that cut across male and female lines, liberal and conservative line. They're actually nonpartisan issues. Since he became elected president after having won his election in the Great Lakes, President Trump has done what amounts to a war on the Great Lakes when it comes to his policies and his budgets, wanting to move the EPA Region 5 Great Lakes office from Chicago to Lenexa, Kansas. So if there were an oil spill in the Great Lakes, we're going to clean it up better from Lenexa, Kansas. Zeroing out the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, a program that's really worked, and on and on and on. This is the sort of issue that can be taken to voters in a coalition way, bringing together men, women, liberals, Republicans, conservatives, to make a winning majority in the places that matter. So while we need to do on the one door closes, federal government on clean energy, as Ryan was talking about, another door opens. Let's move it at the state and local and the private sector level in terms of accelerating solar energy plus storage and wind power. Great Lakes, safe, clean drinking water, that's an issue we win on.
Thanks. I'm with the Nature Conservancy, and I'll start by saying that we're a nonpartisan organization. And as such, most of our supporters are, they're just sort of right down the middle. So we have Democrats, Republicans, and people who identify as independent. And this is an important aspect of our organization because in the face of a failed legislative scenario at the federal level and at many of the state levels, being able to be out on the ground and having the dialogue about environment and how we all need environment to be healthy in order to have the clean drinking water and the breathable air and so on is a must. And so I'll give an example. We work with farmers throughout the Corn Belt, and one of the main issues that we're seeing is, of course, the degradation of drinking water. So the concentration of farming nutrients are running into the water, and they're causing these algal blooms that are toxic. And there's no real regulation around these non-point source water pollution sources. And so if you were to go to a farmer and say, are you all for climate regulation? They would not be for that. In fact, they would be pretty worried about that. But if you talked about the fact that working to keep the nutrients on the land as opposed to in the water will help their bottom line, and the fact that soil health is a way to sequester carbon and also help them have healthier soil and better growing environment, they're all ears. And so just being able to have those conversations, it's important to be able to put aside whether you're red or blue and talk about win-win situations.
Thanks, Cam. It's great to have so many change makers in Chicago from around the country here this week. We really hope some of the energy that you bring rubs off here because we have a lot of change to make here in Illinois if we're going to make us the bold leader that this country needs right now on so many of these issues. I think the opportunity that we see, and actually also it's a mandate, is to use this moment to build the bigger, more inclusive environmental movement that I know many of us have been working on for a long time. If you think about an issue like climate change and why we're not winning, it's because the people who are most affected by climate change, think about communities of color, disadvantaged, poor communities, immigrant communities, they're normally not in the conversation in the effort to solve it because they're under attack from so many different directions, and especially from this administration. So we have an obligation, we feel, to stand with them in their moment of need and help build that bigger movement. That's why you see the Sierra Club reaching beyond our traditional selves and being a part of things like a path to citizenship and the fight for a living wage and the fight for 15, certainly the right for union workers to organize. We need all these good jobs in clean energy to be good family-sustaining jobs. So that's an opportunity that is born out of great difficulty right now, but we're actually heartened by the fact that people are seeing the intersectionality between our movement and all these other social change movements at a moment when we need it the most.
Well, I think you're starting to get at one of the key questions here, Jack, and Howard touched on this one as well, which is what is winning? You know, if you look at virtually any change that has happened in any significant way in this country or any other country on the face of the planet, it has usually involved building coalitions. And one of the things that you just touched on, Jack, is the building of the environmental movement. How do we redefine or reshape the dialogue? How do we reshape the coalition so that we are able to make more progress when it comes to the things that people really care about? The environment to one person may be climate change. The environment to another person may be a landfill that's in their neighborhood. The environment to somebody else may be their child having asthma. How do we build the coalition so that we're not always talking about the environment as if it's something off there in the distance, but rather it's personalized so that we can win more?
I think it starts with reciprocity, right? Because the environment oftentimes means not something that is on our advocacy agenda necessarily. It could be as simple as not feeling safe going to your neighborhood park because of community violence in your community or what have you. So having that reciprocity, that if we want to work with people, say, to save the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, we also got to understand that people are worried about the quality of the tap, the water coming out of their tap, right? So being able to share our agendas and our power with the communities that we hope to work with, I think, is a big part of that.
And I would say with the building coalitions that the work isn't, just when crisis happens, like a Flint or a massive flood and levee breaking, in our river systems. It's really that drumbeat of being at the table to have the conversation around how do we have the things that we all see as essential. We all need to eat and drink. We also need to have economic, action or industry, but it has to coexist. And when you have like minds at the table, there can be disagreement, but in general, you've just got to keep that drumbeat. One thing that we've worked together on quite closely has been the Chicago area waterways and the aquatic invasive species. And in that case, it brings together, industry, environmental groups, and governments. And there's a lot of contention around anchoring. And as I think about those coalition building, one of the barriers that we have is that certainly industry lobby has anchoring that goes on, that they don't budge. But when you get into those nuanced conversations with the leaders of companies, they understand that resiliency and safety of their own supply chain to maximize shareholder value involves a much more nuanced approach than just than butting heads about sustainability.
Some of it is in language and some of it is in how issues are framed and seen by people. The great movements of change in our country have been about civil rights. African American civil rights, the movement of the 1950s and 60s, women's rights movements in the 60s through the 80s, LGBT, same-sex marriage over the last decade or so of change. The right to breathe healthy air. The right to drink safe, clean drinking water, the right to live in communities without toxic threats. Those are civil rights, those are human rights. They're environmental issues, but they need to be looked at for the many people that can, should be, and are engaged as civil rights and human rights. And that fits within the pattern of the great movements of change we've had in this country over the last 50 years. That maximizes our success, that builds the coalition, that grows the coalition, and that's the coalition, as we've seen, can win in powerful ways in our country. And that's a little bit different framing than the historic conservation movement we've had in the United States that really has done so much to protect our national parks, our landscapes, our rivers, our lakes and streams, but it's a different way of looking at it. And that's a powerful force for change.
I think it's really interesting, Howard, the way you're thinking about it is, let's go out and listen, let's reframe our message to build a vision that more people are excited about. And I think the way I've been thinking about it is probably closer to where Jack is, which is more like, let's go out and listen and see, what do you care about? And sometimes it's extraordinarily transactional. You care about minimum wage? Well, we're going to help you there so that you jump on board with our environmental initiative. You know, another thing that you know, you will hear if you go out and listen is, what do people care about? How can I reframe my issue, my message, climate change policy to matter to you? So we both want the same thing. We want more wind turbines in the ground and fewer coal plants. In the case of a lot of folks out in the Midwest, Trump voters, independents, conservatives, Democrats, of course, they care about jobs, 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 and jobs. So I spend a lot of my time on wind power, the American Wind Energy Association. Their message is not about clean, green, vision, human right, anything. Their message is essentially about, how does this create more jobs, or how does this help communities that are really struggling? And that's one place that you end up if you go out and listen to folks that you really want on board with your coalition, even people that we might not expect to be part of it.
You know, let me sort of agree with half and disagree with half. Okay. Part, yes, it's about framing. Part of it's about reciprocity and transaction. Part of it's about values. Okay? And that's the half. The first, maybe I agree 2/3, okay? The first 2/3, I agree with you. The third, this is about values. Part of it is, I began as a civil rights attorney. That's how I spent the beginning of my career, and then I morphed into doing environmental issues. I don't see them as being that different. These are civil rights, these are human rights. So part of it, I think, Jack, you're right, it's how do we listen to and hear people and engage with issues they care about, the reciprocity, transactional way you're referring to. And some of it is about framing. Yes, Ryan. Sure. But some of it also goes to, what are people's core values, and how do we share core values? And that's about listening, but that's also just, what are the values we share? And I don't think there's a lot of disagreement by people in this country that we want to have a basic right to breathe healthy, clean air. It's a basic right to be able to drink safe drinking water. And it's a basic human right to be able to live in communities without toxics. Reciprocity, okay. Transactional framing, okay. But it also goes to, what are our core American values? And when we get to values where there's 80–90% agreement, then we have a powerful coalition that can win.
So I just want to add, because I agree so much with that, and I also think about some of the work that Environmental Law Policy Center did with your polling that is so powerful, and thinking about the source of the messenger and how important that is in this age of media being what it is. And one of the things that you brought out in that report was that proximity of the voice. So one might not trust academics for climate change, but if I'm sitting in Ypsilanti, Michigan, and the University of Michigan professor on climate says this is happening, well, maybe I'll believe him or her. And so that thinking about coalition building, about how do you get the message makers and influencers to deliver the message is a nuance that is very important.
People in Michigan trust Michigan State, University of Michigan scientists, Eastern Michigan and IPSI. They don't trust as much Berkeley and MIT. Guess what? In Ohio, they trust Buckeyes, okay? Not so much Michigan.
And farmers, they trust
Same
farmer next door.
So
yes,
we only have a few minutes left, and I do want to queue up a question or two, so start thinking about it very quickly. You know, we've identified, I think, some ingredients to a core recipe here for how we can get more people to care about the planet that we all share. How do we push that into action? How do we move that over the threshold into those kinds of tangible wins to be able to make progress. Some of it's communication, some of it is transactional, some of it's identifying and articulating those values. And yes, Howard, I agree completely. It is about equity. If you look at education policy, environmental policy, you look at women's rights, it is about equity. Who's making the decisions and who's on the receiving end of those decisions? It's about equity. How do we pull those ingredients together into a cohesive recipe for action? Give us 30 seconds each on that, and then I want to open it up.
So get the most important, well-funded, smartest, best activist actors in the room and get them to agree on 15 words.
I'll do this in 15 words or less. We're not about fighting the good fight. We're about playing to win and getting it done. That maybe says 12.
Michelle, hit it.
To me, it's meeting people where they are and having a ground game to have the conversation in terms that works for people, regardless of side.
We've got a lot of elections to win, and we need to do it by communicating with voters about our issues, showing candidates and party leaders that they won because our issues made a difference.
Makes sense. Great. You have got some of the best minds here anywhere, in not just the region, in the country, in terms of thinkers thinking about these things. So please, why don't you go ahead and ask away here while we have just a couple of minutes left. Yes, please.
All right, I'm gonna toss it.
Nice. Nice pass.
That's fun. Hello. The environment's incredibly important to me. So I certainly donate money to various causes, organizations that are here, but I'd like to know, how can I do more? What can I do as somebody who's not a professional in this world? How can I help these causes?
Great. The question was, how can I help? What can I do? I'm going to just take a very quick shot at that as well, and that is find folks in your community who share those values and get involved with them. That's the easiest, fastest way to help you through kind of the morass of decisions and things like that that can really be overwhelming sometimes. But I'm not going to go in order here. It's just going to be a mosh pit. Whoever answers first wins.
I'll give one.
Go, Michelle.
It's a tie.
Voice.nature.org is a website that we've created a few years back that goes through nationally the legislative agenda that the Nature Conservancy is promoting. You can dive down into grassroots efforts and see what the issues are and what you need to do.
This is how Sierra Club gets stuff done. You know, here in Illinois, we're doing so much in this state with basically 11 or 12 staff people. So it's the hundreds and hundreds of volunteers. And since the election, we've thrown open the doors. People are coming in, and it's one of the things that gives us hope. So thanks for your support. Come join us.
So I would say pick an organization. These three are great. And just call the number on their website and say, I want to help. They are generally very, very good at figuring out how to educate you, get you involved, help you network, find a way to make a difference. The best way to do it is just to find one place and start leveling up your engagement.
Combination of all three. Different issues drive different people. What matters most to you might be something different than the woman who's sitting right in front of you. Pick the organization, pick the issue you care about most and are passionate about most, because that's how you'll be able to make the biggest difference in doing what Michelle and Jack and Ryan are talking about.
We're out of time, but can you guys stick around off mic and just hear Miller on the stage just for a few minutes? Anybody else who has questions, I want to invite you to just come on up. But thank you for coming out. Thank you for thinking about this stuff. And thank you even more for acting on this stuff. If you don't act, all the thinking in the world doesn't do you that much good. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Great.